Hi, and welcome to this episode of What's the Risk? In this episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. Generally, we focus on a single attack, and we walk through that attack and we kind of break it down. We pull out best practices, we understand how it executed, and then we use that information and I walk you through how to quantify the risk of that attack. In this episode, I want to talk about exploitable vulnerabilities. And I'll explain this as I get a little bit further in and why I'm doing this as opposed to another single attack. So let's just get started. When we think about attacks, there's always the underlying issues. And most of those lead back to what I call exploitable vulnerabilities. And these are the kinds of vulnerabilities that attackers can leverage and do leverage. And this is what allows them to move laterally inside your network. This is how they get beyond the initial malware deployment and the breach of the initial machine. And this is how they find the data, they get access to the data, and are able to embed themselves into networks and exist there long term. And it's all about these exploitable vulnerabilities. So I want to spend some time talking about this because if you can understand this and understand a way that I'm going to show you to be able to find these on your own and then be able to eliminate them, then this will put you a long way down the road to being able to reduce your attack surface. And that's what closes the door on attackers being able to execute these attacks. So to do this, you first need to get the information about the vulnerabilities that exist in your network. And the way that you're going to do that is with scanners. So there are the Scap Scanners, SCAP, that's the standard protocol that all of these scanners use. It's an industry standard so that they're all consuming the same standardized files that vendors provide, and they use the same standard file. So it doesn't matter if the scanner you're using, if it is SCAP compliant, it'll use these standard files. So it's industry standard. And you import these files into the scanner, and then with that scanner, let's say you have the scanner software loaded on your laptop. Then with that scanner, you then scan one or more systems in your environment. And so what it does is it reaches out to that other system. It can be a server, firewall, anything. And the file that it has, that you've imported into it, has all of the security checks for that kind of device. So like if I were in an environment of size, I might scan all of my Windows 12 servers at once. I might scan all my firewalls. I might scan my switches. I might then scan all my workstations that are like the same operating system together, right? So you might scan in groups just to keep things simple. And then when it accesses these systems, you provide the credentials so it has deep access. You can also do it uncredentialed, which is just a surface scan. But to get the data that we're talking about, you want to do a credentialed, what's called a credentialed scan. So it has admin privileges, it gets deep access to the box, and you find all of the internal vulnerabilities that a surface scan might not reveal. And then it collects this data. So while it's scanning, there's communication back and forth between the scanner and the devices being scanned. It's doing queries, they're giving responses, and it collects all this data. That becomes your, what I call the vulnerability data, right? That's what we're talking about. So what happens is every vendor, whenever they have a weakness, they submit that to the National Vulnerability Database. They're given a CVE number right, that's associated. And it's also given a rating, which is the CVSS score. That's another industry standard. You can read all about that on the National Vulnerability Database. You can Google that, go online. Everything I'm telling you about is up there. All of the hardening guides that these Scap Scanners consume are there. You can also use them to manually harden your boxes. And there's an entire section that goes into deep detail about the CVSS score or rating. And generally, this number, it's like a number from 1 to 10, right? With 10 being the worst. This number is usually what people will use to prioritize which vulnerabilities they fix first. So if it's critical, it has a value of 9 or 10, they'll patch those first, which makes a lot of sense in one way, but here's kind of the problem with that method. A lot of the vulnerabilities that are exploitable vulnerabilities in your network, the vulnerabilities that an attacker could leverage, are not all necessarily critical. Many of them might be a moderate vulnerability. For example, if you have a vulnerability that would allow an attacker to elevate privileges, that's probably not going to be critical. So, but yet, that is a vulnerability that they could leverage once they were in your network to gain access, elevate their privileges, and then move laterally. So a lot of these, air quotes, exploitable vulnerabilities that I'm talking about are not going to have a high CVSS. Instead, hackers will use them in combinations to work their way together, gaining more access into networks and systems. So this CVSS rating, if you're just using that, what happens is you'll spend all your time going after the criticals, which is of value. But what ends up happening is more and more of the patches that you just don't have time to get to because they're mediums, they weren't critical, right? So they weren't priority number one. They don't get fixed and they sit in your network. And over time, now, if a hacker gains access, there's lots of opportunity for them to get access to other systems, elevate their privileges, move laterally, get that data, and that's what happens, right? When we say a vulnerability here, I'm talking about any kind of a weakness. It can be a flaw in operating system, application, API interface, in a protocol, in crypto. Or it could be an error in how the system is configured. In other words, the system isn't configured optimally. It isn't hardened as much as it could be. It could be any or either combination of these. So we're not talking about, oh, a patch was missing, right? That's easy if a patch was missing. Lots of times that's how attacks will occur. You'll hear about, oh, so-and-so got hacked, but they didn't apply the patch. But that's only, and so what I'm trying to say is that's only one class of the kind of vulnerabilities that attackers can exploit. There's this other class which is either a flaw yet to be known, so there is no patch, right? It's just simply a flaw, and it can be a flaw in the way something functions, in the way it processes memory, and it's not something that there's a patch for, it's just a flaw, or it's an error, a weakness in the configuration. The system just hasn't been hardened enough, and there's no patch for that, right? Exactly. So what are some of the common vulnerabilities that are easily exploited? And there's a long list. We're just talking about some of these. So things like an SQL injection, that would occur on a web server. It could be an internet-facing or an internal servicing web server. So an SQL injection, which is simply code that's inserted and the SQL breaks, right? It can be broken authentication. So I know that I have talked about several attacks in prior episodes where the authentication was compromised. There was a weakness. Often things like deprecated protocols that have been outdated. Somebody's still running them and they're used for authentication. Okay, the protocol actually works, but it's just weak. Somebody learned how to break it, and so now it's more easily attacked. So you'll have things like that when I say broken authentication that we're talking about. Not that it doesn't function, but it's a vulnerability. It's weak. It's easily compromised. Or you'll have things like cross-site scripting, which is very close to SQL. Again, it's a kind of attack that you will see on web-based servers or applications. Or you just have a misconfiguration. It's either incorrectly configured, it's not configured the way you intended it to be, or it's not fully hardened. So these existing vulnerabilities can be leveraged in combination. So it's not just that there's one, there could be 1, 2, 3 that are used in combination in order to breach the box or expose some data that's then used with another exploit to get further into the system. And so understanding what these vulnerabilities are and then how do you find them, it matters because this is how you're going to close the door to these opportunities for hackers to exploit your system internally. So here are some interesting stats that I just pulled off the internet, just recently released. Security Affairs report says 84% of companies are concerned that they've been compromised and don't know it. 28 have been hacked and are aware of the attack. So 84% are concerned that they could be compromised and don't know it. Now that's a very realistic statistic when you understand that large companies have more money to put towards perimeter defense and internal network traffic monitoring and so forth. Medium and small size companies don't have the money necessarily to put towards that tech. And that's where a lot of the breaches and attacks are being focused, because the hackers also know this. They also know that if they can get past the perimeter, if they can drop one piece of malware, if they can socially engineer one person to click the link, they're in. And once they're in, they know they're not going to be able to monitor me moving. I'm going to have enough time to get in there, and they're going to be overwhelmed and haven't, learned how to eliminate the vulnerabilities I'm talking to you about. So they know they're going to be able to move laterally. And unless you have the right configuration and tech in place, this is all going to happen. You might have no indications at all, and there won't be a way for you to see it, right? And so this percentage of 84 is very believable. This is not an inflated percentage, in my opinion, at all. And it does show that there has been more awareness around this issue in recent years. Some of the top causes, we look at things like a lack of awareness around cloud security and policies. Exactly how do you secure that in the cloud, right? So many businesses are moving to the cloud, and administrators are learning new platforms. So the same servers and apps and operating system I would have used in-house, when it moves to the cloud, it functions different. And so oftentimes there can be this lack of awareness or education around exactly how those controls work. Maybe they don't work exactly the way you think they work, right? So that's number one. And we've seen that a lot. And so that's 52% has been reported for just the lack of awareness piece. Then you have lack of adequate controls and oversight. That's 49%. And I want to break this down. That's really two things. Lack of adequate controls, that's one, and oversight is another. So if you don't have controls like removing all unnecessary services, implementing least privileges, right? Those are controls. If you don't have those kinds of policies in place, those controls, then that kind of system lockdown doesn't happen, right? That's what they're they're talking about here. And the second part of this is oversight. When, especially operational systems, when operational systems are, their configurations are changed, modified, edited, updated, right? If you implement what I call the two-man rule, which is the oversight piece, then that allows you to eliminate probably 99% of these kinds of errors. So what I'm saying is having a control board, a large company would be called a control board, a configuration board. In a smaller or a mid-sized company, it can be a less formal, but it needs to be a process. You need to have a process so that those changes are reviewed and approved. And I don't mean they submit a paper and say, oh, I'm going to roll out these new changes. Yes, we approve the changes. I mean, document what the change is and have that change reviewed by knowledgeable staff. And what you're doing is you're trying to eliminate errors. So it's not just the process of saying, yes, I know we're going to make the change. Really go over exactly what the change is. And you should have processes for these changes, and are the processes being applied? Now, I know that's a lot of overhead, and people are going to push back on that, but that's how you eliminate these kinds of mistakes. And 49%, that's a big chunk, right? So that's how you eliminate those things. The next one is the presence of too many APIs to adequately govern, and that's 43%. The complexity of the networks are increasing, and the same number of admins are now administering more and more variety of these APIs, and the software components are increasing. And yes, again, that's totally believable that 43% would say it comes down to the complexity. I don't doubt it at all. Operating systems are always changing what they're doing. The software is as well is always changing. It's extremely difficult to keep up with that. But if you don't, then that's how these things happen, right? So it's very difficult. And then the last one is just negligent insider behavior. There are so many attacks when we go through them that we hear that it was a disgruntled employee or it was somebody who just wasn't doing their job, right? So unfortunately, that is a component. Now, Verizon data breach report, this was 2020. They say that the misconfigurations, just that one thing, caused 10% of all the breaches they reported. That's pretty staggering. 10% is misconfiguration. And more than 39% of web applications were breached in this manner. That's a lot. Misconfigurations. Two-man rule. That's what I'm going to keep saying. Two-man rule, right? Misconfigurations will cause in the future 99% of all firewall breaches through 2023. Now that's from Gartner. So these are just some public statistics around these vulnerabilities that are exploitable, and getting you to think about the importance of these and why I want you to pay attention to these and learn how to find them so that you can fix them. Privilege escalation is probably the second highest exploitable vulnerability, and it's not going to be a critical. I think I mentioned that before. Once they get in and they gain a minor foothold, being able to elevate their privileges, that opens up the gate. So now that we've broken it down a little bit, let's talk about some of the best practices. So always hardening the systems and including system hardening checks in your vulnerability management. So back to the scanners and collecting that vulnerability data. Don't just scan and check for what patches are missing and that sort of thing. Institute within your organizations a system hardening, a level of hardening your systems where it is policy driven, and then using those hardening checks to make sure that you have it hardened the way that you want and it's consistent across all the systems, right? And that will go a long way in helping you identify and then eliminate those weaknesses. Now, when you run these hardening guides, you're going to come up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of findings. You're focusing on the findings that are exploitable, right? And you're not going to lock the box down to the point that it's non-functional. But you are going to eliminate unnecessary services and insecure protocols and those kinds of things. And you are going to prevent users from having the ability to do things like install software, right? Exactly. Okay. Number 2, have a baseline configuration for all system types. Now, that might seem kind of self-evident, but what we're talking about here is consistently applying this configuration. So many organizations that say, oh yeah, we're running Windows 11, we're running Server 2012. Which versions? Each version of that operating system should have its own configuration to be locked in, because there are going to be differences. And if you don't do it that way, those inconsistencies will leave vulnerabilities that could be leveraged, right? So that's the takeaway. Next point, the Scap hardening guides that I was talking about. Use those and do your vulnerability management in an automated way. Use the scans, do the checks, and then prioritize what you really need to go after to fix. Not everything, because it's going to be way too much. You're going after those vulnerabilities which are exploitable. And I'll show you, talk to you, tell you how you identify those out of the hundreds that it's going to identify, right, for most systems. The next one, having the ability to do this and the strategy. So you want to gain the ability to identify the exploitable vulnerabilities and then have a strategy for how you prioritize them for remediation. So we're going to talk about now about this ability, which is not that complicated, and then how to prioritize, which also is not that complicated. But if you don't have the ability and you don't have the strategy, you're never going to tackle this. You will never succeed at this. So to get the ability to do this, you want to, and the ability that we're talking about is the ability not only to generate the vulnerability data, but to perform the analysis. You want to be able to analyze the vulnerabilities, and you're going to do that by common themes like vendor weaknesses, right? Categorize it by vendor, or characteristics like unsupported software, right? And by other characteristics like exploitability. How do you know exploitability? It's going to be those things that compromise integrity or availability or confidentiality, right? So now let's talk about quantifying the risk. And really, now we're going to talk about the vulnerability tagging, because that is how you analyze the vulnerabilities. That's how you quantify the risk, is by preparing the data for analysis. And to prepare it for that analysis, you first have to tag it. This is how you identify. The tagging is how you identify those exploitable vulnerabilities. They're tagged in such a way that makes it clear that that could be exploited. So let me explain. We have a vulnerability tagging tool. It's just an Excel spreadsheet that has been used. I've used this for years. And what happens is, in that data, right, back to the National Vulnerability Database, where vendors post their vulnerabilities, right, and those hardening guides, the way that they're written, the CVEs, the way that they're written, and the hardening guides that tell you how to harden your systems, the way they're written, they use certain terminology. And this terminology is how they describe weaknesses. So it ends up that there are key words that can be used that will quickly, out of a large data set, identify the exploitable vulnerabilities. There are key phrases that are used consistently by all the vendors, both in the vulnerability and in the hardening guides, to identify these things. And after many years, this has become very apparent, and I have that list. I can share that with you, and we have that in the tool, and that this is how you do it. This is how you do the tagging and it immediately identifies the vulnerabilities that have those keywords in them, and those are your exploitables. So the keywords are things like privilege escalation, code execution, denial of service. And there's a list of these. All of these are exploitable. And these are the ones you want to focus on. This is how you prioritize your patching. This is how you close the door on the hackers. This is how you shut down entire groups of attacks, and they just won't be able to execute because they won't have a way to move laterally. So the manufacturers use these keywords in the CVE descriptions, and it's pretty straightforward to just extract them from the text. And that's what the spreadsheet does. That's what the tagging, that's how it works. You can use things like a vendor or a product name to categorize and group certain findings. That would help you when you are prioritizing to say, oh, we use Microsoft for our internet-facing web servers. That vendor and that operating system we will prioritize because it is associated with a high-value target. Is this beginning to make sense? You're going to associate. That's why you do the vendor and the product name, because those relate to your key assets. Exactly. Great. Okay. So once the data is tagged, then you will have numbers that are generated so you can see how many are in each of the categories right away. Now we have generated numbers. Now we can do more analysis. From that, you can do charting and all kinds of analysis now can be done on that because you've assigned numeric values to this, and you've grouped it and organized your data. And wow, it just is so easy from that point to really make sure that you are focusing your limited resources on the highest priority items. Does that make sense? If a vulnerability could not be exploited, it should not be a priority. Make sense? Absolutely. Okay. All of this aligns to make it super simple for you to prepare top-level reporting, slides, and charts. You've got to be able to not only do the analysis, but share that information. You're going to have to create reports and documents, whether it's emails or formal briefs, and share this information not only in the charting and the numbers by the categories, but also the kinds and types, and then the detailed lists so that somebody can take that and go take action on it. Does that make sense? Awesome. So I know this was a little bit different, but I think it's well worth the time to talk about. And I know that many places are not doing this kind of work. And this is why you hear people talk about vulnerability management being so tiresome and you don't see progress. You see the numbers come in every month and you work like heck and they drop a little bit and then they pop back up again next month when the next patches are out. And it just feels like it's a never-ending process. I'm telling you, using this kind of analysis, you will see your overall numbers drop by 50%, 1, 2, 3 quarters in a row, until your numbers will stabilize at something that is a fraction of what you started with. Does that make sense? And it's measurable progress. And you know when you've done it that you have now reduced that attack surface. And that's what the whole thing is about. All right. That's all I'm going to give you for today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, drop us a note. We're over at fizmax.com, and we'll see you in the next episode.